Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let us begin by observing a minute of silence for the innocent victims of the mass shootings last week. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you to our event on the Hungarian Foreign Policy in the Western Balkans. This Monday, we published the research entitled Balkan Csárdas, Hungarian Foreign Policy Dance. And our research in Hungary engaged a sizable team of BCSP researchers, some of which will be speaking at the panel today, and members of the BCSP International Advisory Committee. It consisted both of desk research and of field research in Hungary and Serbia's province of Vojvodina, where we conducted a number of interviews with Hungarian and local experts on the topic. And we are happy to host some of them today. Journalistic account on Hungarian involvement in the region of the Western Balkans is plentiful. But this is probably the first independent and comprehensive work on Hungarian foreign and trade policy in the region. And I would like also to point out that this research is part of a larger effort to track and analyze the role of different foreign actors in the region of the Western Balkans. The Belgrade Centre for Security Policy already conducted research on the role of China in the Western Balkans. And within our Safe Haven program that is hosting Ukrainian, Russian, and researchers from Belarus that fled the war and dictatorship, we conducted research on Russia's foreign policy in the region, Serbian-Ukrainian ties, and so on. And I really invite you to consult these publications if you haven't already on our website. And as we speak, another team of researchers of our think tank is working on the completion of a similar report on Turkish foreign policy in the Western Balkans that will be launched in June. So within our efforts to regionalize the work of the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy, we are organizing public and Chatham House discussions of our work throughout the region of the Western Balkans. And last month in Podgorica, we organized the first edition of our BCSC leaders meeting that saw the participation of the President-elect of Montenegro, Jakov Milatovic, and the Prime Minister, Drita Nabazovic, at the public panel. And at the Chatham House panel that went back-to-back with it, we discussed our recent publication on the Russian influence in the Western Balkans in the context of the war in Ukraine. Next week, we are organizing the second of the BCSC leaders meetings in Skopje in North Macedonia. We'll have a public panel hosting the president of the country, Stevo Pendarovski, government ministers and other distinguished speakers. And at the Chatham House discussion that will go after it, we will present this paper. So finally, all this research will also be a topic of discussion at our annual flagship conference, the Belgrade Security Conference, that is taking place from 11th to 13th of October this year, and to which you're all kindly invited to join. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's talk about Hungary and the Western Balkans.
Well, Well, good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me well. So welcome also from my behalf. I'm Nikola Burazder, and I'll have the pleasure of moderating this panel discussion titled Hungarian Foreign Policy, a Strategy Behind the Balkan Ties. Here with us we have a group of distinguished speakers from Serbia and Hungary. To my right, Maja Bieloš, the senior researcher at the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy, and Ivana Ranković, junior researcher at the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy. They are two among the authors of the recently published BCSP publication, Balkan Čardaš, Hungarian Foreign Policy Dance, about which Srdjan already spoke about, which I also quite warmly recommend you to read. And here also with us we have for Hungary, Mr. Ferenc Nemet, the research fellow at the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs, and Ms. Zsuzsana Szelenyi, director at the Democracy Institute Leadership Academy of the Central European University. Welcome. Let me begin with a pretty, I would say, general question first to Ms. Bieloš. You have been one of the authors of the publication. How would you describe Hungarian foreign policy in the Western Balkans, and which are the most important aspects of Hungarian foreign policy in the region?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say that, as Srdjan mentioned, like for too long we focused on the role of the so-called third actors in the Western Balkans, completely overlooking that Hungarian increased its presence in the Balkans, and the role of Hungary has been more active since Viktor Orban came to power in 2010. But this is a part of the wider Hungarian strategy of the Eastern opening. What we have discovered through our research is that there is no a single coherent foreign policy strategy toward the Western Balkans. However, there are few references to the region in several key strategic documents, such as the National Security Strategy from 2021. We also have learned that interest in Western Balkans grew over the years as the new generation of diplomats and officials actually from Vojvodina joined the Hungarian government. So that drive for more cooperation with Western Balkans, but also in particular with Serbia, is influenced also by certain people who are from the region but not currently working in the government. What is particularly important for when it comes to the foreign policy is that foreign policy decision making is centralized and personalized. So Orban's speeches serve as guidelines in foreign policy more than documents. We have seen that last year in December from Tirana, Orban said that Western Balkans are particularly important for Hungary. Orban is perceived as a pragmatic and interest-driven leader, but many of his foreign policy actions are explained to domestic public in ideological terms and in emotional terms. For example, more cooperation with Serbia and North Macedonia in the context of prevention of illegal migration fits into the narrative of protecting Christianity and Hungarian traditional values and ways of life. I would describe Hungary's approach towards the Western Balkans as a combination of strong economic incentives to boost foreign trade, but also to expand the power of big companies. Then a combination of media investments across the region, but also soft power tools which would improve the position of Hungarian communities in neighboring countries. Out of all foreign policy priorities, I would only focus currently on the two. I will single out the importance for Hungary to focus on security and stability of the region, and promoting fast-track accession of Western Balkan countries to the EU. When it comes to the first priority, when it comes to increasing more security, since the war in former Yugoslavia, since the war of the 90s, Hungary is very much interested in further preventing a spillover of the instability from the Balkans. Hungary plays a very important role also as a security provider and actively contributes to EU peacekeeping mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the NATO mission in Kosovo. It is when in that security area, it is also interested in tightening the control of the Balkan migrant route and improving cooperation, as I said, with Serbia and North Macedonia in particular. Orban also has, Orban built an image of a mediator and someone who can talk with the tough guys from the Balkans, such as Vučić and Dodik. So sometimes he plays that role of a mediator for the EU purposes, and nurtures more close ties with Dodik and Vučić. What is the contradiction in the actions of Hungary, and what is perceived as a contradiction is that Hungary supports, at the same time, Hungary supports the stability of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it is also perceived that Orban supports very much Dodik, who threatens to destabilize the country. The need actually for regional stabilization is one of the key arguments for Hungary to be more vocal and more in support of accelerated accession of Western Balkan countries into the EU. However, many experts just highlight that motives for this are sometimes that Hungary and Orban wants to increase the number of like-minded regimes within the EU. The only time Hungary actually threatened to veto one country and block the integration was in the case of Serbia, when Serbia a long time ago it was the case over the restitution law when lawmakers wanted to exempt Hungarians from Vojvodina due to the crimes committed during the World War II. But political rapprochement actually led to overcoming these issues. When in this EU context, Hungary plays a buffer role between the EU and Western Balkan countries, which means that it wants to reduce the pressure coming from Brussels technocrats to the Balkan leaders, as well as it is perceived that Hungary is trying to diminish some criticism coming from the Brussels towards certain countries, especially diminished criticism in the official EU documents. The EU Commissioner Varhelyi, however, is seen as a true friend and ally of Balkan countries, particularly when it comes to Serbia. But he's also criticized that he's polishing EU documents, but also he's taking credit for certain achievements in the enlargement process, such as opening of the negotiations, for example, with Albania and Macedonia. Contradictory in this, some contradiction in this regard is that Hungary advocates, from one side, speedy integration of Western Balkan countries into the EU, but at the same time, it offers an alternative to liberal democracies, thereby undermining the whole process, but also the EU project as well. What we have recently seen that Hungary supports Kosovo independence, but is also at the same time it can play other role by actually voting against Kosovo membership into the Council of Europe. So I will stop here, but these are two priorities I would like to. passing on.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of these issues later, especially, Hungary's EU membership and the position it has in the EU. This is, for me, a very interesting topic, but let's move on now. Ms. Rankovic, we have heard here from Maya about good bilateral relations between, even personal relations between Orban and Vučić and Orban and Dodik, and also at the same time, Hungarian interest in achieving stability in the region, maybe above all else. How do you see these bilateral relations of Hungary in the region? Is it ideological, is it value-based, or it is more pragmatic and has to do more with personalities than ideology?
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you all for coming today. When it comes to the bilateral relations between Hungary and the Western Balkan countries, there are different priorities, bilateral priorities, and therefore different levels of cooperation are established between the countries and Hungary. But what is the one important overall political goal of the current Hungarian regime in the region is that maintaining of close relations between the Western Balkan countries and Hungary. And first that comes to mind when we say nurturing of close relations is definitely the relationship between President Vučić and Prime Minister Orban. But there is also, as you said, the close relation with Dodik, President of the Republic of Srpska, and also relations with VMRO, the PMN, the largest opposition party in North Macedonia, should also not be overlooked. And at the first glance, when we look at these relations, it seems that they are mostly ideologically motivated. But actually, there are concrete practical interests in both sides that are actually at the core of these bilateral relations. And I will try to explain this through a few examples and to explain why we concluded that these relations are actually more pragmatic rather than ideological. So in case of Serbian-Hungarian relationship, we can clearly see mutual practical interests. First of all, there is the political support that Orban and Vučić provide to one another. And we see that in, for example, them taking part at the election campaigns, also the way that they share and adopt the similar illiberal practices and methods of how to maintain in power. But also there's the support on the international level. For example, Vučić supporting Orban's anti-migration policy, and Orban, for example, supporting Vučić in the EU accession process, actually the access to the EU funds. But also what is behind these relations are the economic interests, and there are plenty of examples how Orban and his inner circle are maintaining close relations to companies and businessmen close to Vučić as well. Another relationship that we mentioned is between Orban and Dodik. And for Dodik, the maintaining of close ties is obvious. First, there is the financial support that he gets directly from Hungarian government through some foundations, but Dodik's party is gaining financial help from Hungary, and also Hungary is the only ally in the EU that legitimizes Dodik's regime and actually protects him in a way that if there are EU decisions that could be made against Dodik, Hungary has the ability to block those decisions. And for Orban, on the other side, what is his interest in this? What Maya already mentioned, the role of mediator between local actors and, in this case, the EU, which is important for Orban not only to somehow weaken the pressure from Brussels in case there are some tensions escalating. So Orban positioning himself as someone who can calm the tensions, that can weaken some of the pressure from Brussels, but also that is a good way for Orban to present himself as a key regional actor to the domestic public. And finally, when it comes to the relationship between VMRO in North Macedonia, Fidesz gave support during the parliamentary elections, although VMRO lost those elections. But the current regime in North Macedonia also has some interest in maintaining the close relations because Hungary is the one who is pushing the EU accession process. And finally, the main interest that is behind all of these relations is the fact that by supporting each other in this way, they are legitimizing their illiberal regimes. And they are legitimizing them not only to the domestic public, but also to international public. So, for example, if Orban is projecting his influence and he is presenting himself as the key regional actor, he is getting the ideological legitimization at home. But, for example, for the Western Balkans, and this goes especially for Serbia, they can use this cooperation with Hungary as a proof that illiberal regimes also exist in the EU. And this gives them an opportunity to say, why should we change our regime when there are similar ones already in the EU? And that is also the reason why, that is also a good opportunity for Hungary to push these regimes to become part of EU, and without any judgment, let's say, and without them criticizing that there are no reforms, and without criticizing the democratic backsliding in the Western Balkans.
Thank you, Ivana. We have heard now from researchers from Serbia about Hungarian foreign policy. Now let's turn to our guests from Hungary to hear about their thoughts on the matter. So, Mr. Nemeth, where is the Western Balkans, in your opinion, in the overall Hungarian foreign policy? How important is it? Is it strategic, as sometimes we have the impression here, or it is not that important for Orban and his government? What's your take on this?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always good to be back in Belgrade, a city that I used to live and actually studied, especially, but it's different now during these sad times. Answering to your question, shortly, the answer is a definite yes. The Western Balkans as a region plays an important role in the Hungarian foreign policy agenda, but this dedicated role hasn't started after Prime Minister Orban got into power again in 2010. But I would go back to the regime change of Hungary, to the period of the 1990s. What is very interesting with regards to the Western Balkans and Hungary's support is that the Hungarian politics is very much divided on anything, including foreign policy issues. But if we need to find a single issue, or let's say a single region that could bring together political parties from all across the national legislation, that would definitely be the Western Balkans. So basically there is this overarching political consensus among political parties represented in the Hungarian legislation on the importance of the Western Balkans and on the importance of having the Western Balkans included in Euro-Atlantic structures, including the NATO and the EU. And this support started as early as the 90s after the regime change in Hungary. Obviously, and also Maya touched upon that, the Hungarian minority in Vojvodina, but also in Croatia and Slovenia, still play an important role in the Hungarian foreign policy. They, in the context of Vojvodina, serve as a good bridge between Belgrade and Budapest. And what is very interesting is that although Hungary supports the community, the Hungarians in Vojvodina, to a large extent with a lot of financial assistance, Serbia doesn't perceive it as a threat. Serbia doesn't perceive the Hungarian support that is given to the Vojvodina Hungarians as an attempt from Budapest to somehow, let's say, destabilize the state or to fuel nationalism among Hungarians against, let's say, state structures of Belgrade, which is very peculiar in my opinion, especially when you take into account the other minorities living in Serbia, such as the Albanians in the Preševo Valley or Bosniaks from the Sanjak region. Another important aspect with regards to, let's say, this dedicated role of the Western Balkans in the Hungarian foreign policy agenda is the security. My fellow panelists also discussed this topic, and I can also justify that what they said was very much the truth, and it stands still today, is that ever since the 90s, Hungary and also the Hungarian society looks at the Western Balkans through this security prism. through this security perspective, because we do have direct or indirect memories from the disintegration of Yugoslavia as well. And ever since the 90s, there is this sense of solidarity, not just towards the Kin minority living in Vojvodina, but towards other nations and ethnicities in the Balkans. And the Hungarian public very much follows what is going on in terms of security-related issues in the Western Balkans ever since. I will just give you a short anecdote. When I moved to Serbia and later on when I moved to Kosovo, my grandma called me screaming on the phone, "Hey, Ferenc, are you going to be okay? Please don't do this and that because it's still dangerous." So what I'm trying to say is that the memories are still alive within the average Hungarians. And yes, I called my grandma an average, but she is obviously not an average grandma. So it's still very much alive, and it really shapes how the Hungarian public thinks about the Western Balkans. After 2010, there has been many gradual changes with regards to how Hungary and the Orban regime perceives the Western Balkans. The strong security focus obviously remained. Like Maya mentioned, Hungary is one of the main contributors to the EUFOR Althea mission, but also we are the second and sometimes the third largest contributors to NATO's KFOR mission in Kosovo. But also after 2010, this security aspect extended to the field of migration, and more recently to energy cooperation and energy security as such. Another very important thing is that, and this is going to be, I think, the most important thing from my introductory speech, is the economic cooperation. This is, I would argue, something new, something that the Fidesz after 2010 brought to its foreign policy agenda with regards to the Western Balkans. And it doesn't only concern major companies such as MOL, which is present in Croatia and Serbia, or OTP, which is through its companies present in Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, and Montenegro, but it also concerns small and medium-sized companies as well. The Hungarian state actively supports with financial incentives those Hungarian companies to have their investments invested in the Western Balkans. Oftentimes that happens in Serbia, in Vojvodina, and to be more precise, in the Hungarian inhabited parts of Vojvodina. But as we could see in recent years, Hungarian investments started appearing in other parts of Serbia or in other parts of the Western Balkans. So I would say is that when it comes to the foreign policy agenda of Hungary, the Western Balkans still plays an important role. The security aspect is still there and visible, and it shapes the entire view on how the political elites think about the Western Balkans. But in addition to that, a strong economic focus and the realization that there is an untapped economic potential for Hungary in the Western Balkans is also something worth mentioning.
I'd like to ask you one more question. Namely, we have heard here that the Western Balkans as a region is important for Hungary, but we also know that the European Union is important for Hungary, and that European level politics are important for Hungary. Would you say that Hungary is, let's say, rather using its EU membership to increase its leverage in the Western Balkans, or that it perhaps uses the Western Balkans as a region where it has influence to strengthen its position in Brussels, or it's both? How would you rather describe this?
I would say it's none. I don't
Sorry,
see.
it's none.
It's none.
None. Okay.
I would say obviously Hungary is one of the main supporter of the region's EU integration. That's for sure, both on a EU level and on the ground as well. But the good relations and the credibility of Hungary doesn't really have anything to do with Hungary's EU membership. I think it comes from it comes from Budapest rather than it comes from the EU level through Hungary to the region. So in that sense, it is really up to, let's say, the political elites, or it is really based on the political elites, whether they want to nurture closer ties to the Western Balkans, with no matter, let's say, their relations to the EU.
Thank you. We'll come to Serbo-Hungarian relations a bit later. Maybe there are some other thoughts on this. But Ms. Seleni, a question for you. How do you see that this foreign policy of Hungary in the Western Balkans, how does it translate into domestic politics in Hungary? So how do voters look on this? How important is it for them? Are there any votes to be won in this way? And what kind of image does Viktor Orban try to project by being, let's say, influential and basically achieving all these foreign policy goals of Hungary in the Western Balkans? What's your take on this?
If you may start with another question first, and then I come to your question. But there is something which I think it's important, and most of the things you said, I absolutely agree. So the Western Balkan is critical for Hungary, and ever since the 90s, it is for it, and there is a few unity in Hungarian political elite that this is the issue, and it was always the case. However, it's significantly changed at 2010, and it's related to the fact that Viktor Orban introduced a new foreign policy paradigm, which is true for the Western Balkan relationship and everything else as well. And this new paradigm is I would say it like a small power politics. So this is a very straightforward, realist approach to foreign policy, which changed a former Hungarian foreign policy paradigm, which was a clear Euro-Atlantic approach, which was for the first 20 years after 1990, this was the common agreement in Hungarian elite and the civics, so the people as well. And an important element has changed with the so-called Eastern opening politics. And I have to say, this report is just fantastic. I have to make it in a bracket, so you have to read it. I haven't had such a wonderful, thoughtful, smart report on the relationship than the report the Institute created. So it's really a fantastic read. So the small power politics, the essence of this is Hungary is a small country at the periphery of the European Union. But that's not a very important and influential position. So Orban is a holistic political thinker. He wants to be influential and stay on power long. And he thinks about foreign policy as a very traditional way. It's like, it's a continuous competition between nations for resources. Conflict is basic element of international relations. Bilateral relations are more important and superior to multilateral relations because there is more room for maneuvering. And he, with the Eastern opening and the Western Balkan, is a part of this policy, is that Hungary creates a position for itself where it is not at the periphery but in the core or something. And Hungary can only be at the core if it opens to the south and the east. So, and this is what he's doing since 2010. It's not even a secret. It's a very profound and outspoken politics. And to build leverage, to room for maneuver, to always create negotiation potential with all those countries which are bigger than Hungary, and also leverage on those who are smaller and maybe less resourceful. That game is a kind of core of the current contemporary Hungarian foreign policy. And this is why while I agree with almost everything you said, I think for your question, it's both. It's not none, but actually both. So Orban is using the Western Balkan relationship for influence building within the EU and vice versa. So now, for your question, how the relationship looks in Hungary and what's the essence of it, I think what is really very important is is the Hungarian minority in Serbia. And let's talk about Serbia now. However, you know, there are Hungarian minority in other countries, so what I'm saying is true for the other minorities in Slovakia, in Romania, specifically in Ukraine. Those minorities, first of all, do have essential identity-making role in Hungary, in internal foreign policy. It goes back to Trianon, to the First World War. It was very important and created a revisionist politics between the two World Wars. This was completely silenced during the communist period. However, already in the 70s and the 80s, the minority issue, which was contradiction with neighbors, so there was not much talk about it. It was a kind of a taboo topic for decades. But when there were already some various social and economic tensions in Hungary, the Hungarian Communist Party actually let this issue come to be discussed in the Hungarian public arena in the 70s and the 80s in order that the Hungarian oppositional elites deal with the minority issue instead of home-born problems. So there were also a tactical reason, and also because as communism was waning as an ideology, all countries in the region went somehow towards nationalism, and it was very practical that Hungarian nationalism was towards the minorities and not within the country. It's a fascinating topic to discuss, but what is important for us now is that this was, when I was a child, with my parents, we traveled all the Hungarian regions, and this was a time when I really felt Hungarian. When I went to Novi Sad and Košice and Cluj-Napoca and Arad, I have photos when I was 10 in the statue of Arad with the heroes of the 1848 revolution, and then I learned how to be Hungarian. I am Hungarian because I am worried about these Hungarians who are not living in Hungary and who do not have such a good life as we have. So this was an identity building thing already in a subtle way, but it was very profound as from 1989. And ever since, for the right-wing parties in Hungary, Hungarian nationality through Hungarianness was elaborated and discussed through the minorities abroad. So, and this was the case in the 90s, and Fidesz party was really very good in putting into a modern format. So Fidesz modernized nationalism in Hungary, which is creating this identity issue. And it has very important roles in internal politics, because every right-wing party in Hungary is basically owning this issue. They own the story. They own the Hungarian minorities abroad. And by this, they basically withdraw the right from liberal or socialist or green or whoever parties to deal with the issues, because it is theirs. And this creates a very strong glue for the support base of Fidesz. So it is an absolute important issue, and it is the most important element of this was in 2007 when there was a referendum on voting rights and citizenships for national minorities, which was unsuccessful back then because it was not valid. But this was a mobilizing campaign for Fidesz after losing the elections in 2006. So it was absolutely operationalized. So Hungarian minorities, while they are really important, as I said, to all Hungarians, because we have a long history of this, it is very professionally operationalized for internal party political fights within Hungary. Therefore, the Western Balkan issue, because it's also somehow related, because the Serbian Hungarian minority is also operationalized for political reasons within Serbia and also in Hungary. Therefore, it's also, the whole politics can be understood as a kind of internal policy issues in Hungary. And can be a divisive story in Hungarian foreign policy. And this is, of course, a huge problem because if it is the story and the issue is owned by Fidesz, the current government forces who on governing do have all the tools and ways to build this very, very intensive influence in the region, as you explained and as the report demonstrates wonderfully, in the holistic way, in economy, in security issues, in migration, in business, in politics. And because of the Hungarian minority, the political representation of a Hungarian minority in Serbia is completely captured by Fidesz party. Therefore, it is a problem in any potential, post-Orban era. And while we can come back to this because I think it's very important for Serbia and how to relate to this very complicated relationship. The Fidesz deals bilateral relations. There's a lot of informality with this, though there is this strategy. Some kind of fragmentation is always in the interest of Orban's politics because it's always about how to build control and make influence over control and dividing partners, rivals, any kind of actors, positive or negative. It's always the element of the issue.
Let me ask you, do you see any other difference in Orban's foreign policy in the Western Balkans in comparison to the previous government? So did this change that you mentioned in 2010, did it change in the way how Western Balkans are dealt with in other ways, not only about national minorities, but in also other aspects? Like, was there some kind of obvious change, or the Hungarian foreign policy interests in the region have remained unchanged, basically?
Well, it's much more strategic this time. So it was a kind of more organic before, as Hungary was before 2010. The foreign policy was mainly within the frameworks of the EU and NATO and other international organizations. Hungary just become members of these organizations, so obviously try to follow the logics. It's completely changed now. Everything is bilateral, and it's partisan. So it's not with all actors in Serbia. It's not with all parties. It's also in the other countries. It's with certain political forces, which is partly because of this ideological community, what you are saying. But it has other aspects as well. If it's partisan also from the Hungarian side, it means that. At the moment, it's in the name of the Hungarian state and the government, obviously, because Fidesz is exercising the government power in Hungary. But lots of informalities can create a situation that if for some reason, and this will come this moment, Viktor Orban will not be the Hungarian prime minister, a lot of informal relationship what will happen with this if these are not institutionalized relationships? First, it could undermine the effort of another government. Second, it would relate, there would be some leverage, substantial leverage in the hand of a non-government political party, maybe private figures, maybe businessmen. So it can be also a confusing element in Serbian or Western Balkan internal politics if there's too much informality.
Thank you very much. Let us turn now to Vojvodina, let's say a region of strategic interest, I would say, and a bridge in a way between Hungary and in Serbia when it comes to specifically Orban and Vučić relations. Majo, a question for you. How do you see, developments in Vojvodina as a result of these, let's say, good bilateral relations between Serbia and Hungary in the last 10 years? What has actually happened, and what is the role of the Hungarian national minority in Vojvodina, and mainly the alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians as a political party which serves as a bridge between the two governments? How does it actually look like on the ground?
Well, Zsana previously and greatly explained and emphasized why for Hungary it's not only important like economic interest, security or lucrative interest, but drive for bigger role and cooperation, in particular for Serbia, is because Serbia is the only country in the Western Balkans with significant Hungarian minority. And we have to also look at rapprochement between the former radicals and current ruling Progressive Party and Vučić, and the strongest local minority party, which is the Alliance of Hungarian Vojvodina Hungarians, is actually an attempt to solidify the relations between the two countries. What is visible is actually that those very good and very cordial relations between the two leaders are not translated at the level of society. That political proximity between these two regimes were not followed by true reconciliation between the two communities. The biggest finding is that relations between the majority population, meaning Serbs and Hungarians in Serbia, have worsened since 2011, especially due to what Zsuzsanna mentioned, nationalist politics and nationalist rhetorics from both sides, but also because of the competition between the Alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians and the ruling Progressive Party in certain multi-ethnic communities in Vojvodina. Also, what worsened relations is that Hungary's attempt to revise history through local leaders and through local parties, which deeply disturbed part of the society in Serbia, especially the erection of monument devoted to the innocent victims of 1944-45 of the communist regime. This initiative actually backfired and caused a lot of wave of protest of citizens that is from the other side criticized or in ways silenced. But all of this, at the end, the result of this or consequences is what people from Vojvodina perceive ghettoization of Hungarians, forgetting about coexistence. And the dominant feeling today is that Hungarians and Serbs, especially in Vojvodina, that they live next to each other, not together. When it comes to different measures or policies toward ethnic Hungarians, we can say that these policies and measures, in order to improve position of Hungarians in Vojvodina, had both positive and negative results. I would highlight two examples. For example, Hungarian law on dual citizenship was beneficial for ethnic Hungarians in Vojvodina, but also for other Serbian citizens who got Hungarian passport with voting rights as well. This was beneficial because it made it provide better life opportunities and enabled citizens of Serbia to travel, live, work, and study in the European Union, but also in other countries such as the US more easily. However, the other side of this coin, it had also a negative effect because it facilitated the mass migration from Serbia. And this was at the end confirmed by the latest results of the 2022 population census that showed dramatic decline in the number of Hungarians in Serbia. Compared to the 2011 census, when there were 253,899 Hungarians in the country, currently 184,442 Hungarians live in Vojvodina. This is a drop of nearly 30%.
In the last 10 years?
In the last 10 years. So it is...
11.
Yeah, it is significant. There are many reasons. One of the reasons is that effect of the law on dual citizenship. But finding is that in the long run, the long-term effect of this policy is that emigration of Hungarians from Vojvodina leads or results in weakening of social cohesion and multiculturalism in Serbia. This immigration of Hungarians from Serbia also prompted the Hungarian government to introduce certain special measures and launch investment scheme for economic development of Hungarian community in Vojvodina. This was good, and this was very beneficial for Hungarians in Vojvodina, and this was emphasized many times because since 2016, many farmers, entrepreneurs, companies received significant funding. They received grants and loans from the Hungarian government administrated through the Prosperitati Foundation in Subotica, and overall, since 2016, they received 252 million. However, this very good financial instrument aimed to economically empower the Hungarian community soon turned into a corrupt scheme to finance the alliance of Vojvodina Hungarians and its clientelistic network, especially during the elections. According to investigative journalists, 58% of the funds, which is 146 million, went into the pockets of 4% of candidates that applied to receive these funds. And all of these candidates were associated either with the alliance, Fidesz, or the ruling progressive party in Serbia. Unfortunately, Hungarian minority in Vojvodina is seen as a voting machine, both for Fidesz and the alliance. Dual citizens had opportunity to participate in 3 cycles of elections, Hungarian elections. And last year, the number of citizens from Vojvodina who voted in the parliament elections in Hungary was the 44,729, which is 65% of those registered in the electoral register. It is unknown how actually dual citizens voted, but what is well known is actually that the alliance mobilized compatriots to register and to vote for Fidesz. It was also noted that even priests in smaller villages in Vojvodina were actually advocating for Fidesz. The last elections were the most controversial so far because political and non-governmental activists associated with the alliance distributed ballots to dual citizens in Serbia. Even journalists reported that many of the activists even assisted to citizens to fill their ballots and even offered their help to collect their ballots and to hand them over to the consulate. This is why many politicians believe that the regularity of the elections in Hungary is quite questionable. One of the biggest assumptions is that due to demographic decline and immigration of Vojvodina Hungarians, the Hungary could lose its political leverage in Serbia. However, out of 5 parties, the minority parties that are currently registered in Serbia, the Alliance of Vojvodina is the strongest. It has stable support, and almost the opposition to the alliance is non-existent. It is also the only party that submitted a list for the elections for the National Council for Hungarian minority in November 2017. and 22, and won all 35 seats. So therefore, we can conclude that there is no fear that political power or either alliance or Fidesz will decline in future if there are fewer Hungarians in Vojvodina. Moreover, if the current situation persists, we can say that Hungarians will not have a choice but to vote for the alliance.
I have to point out a certain paradox that we see here. So on the surface, we see that relations between Belgrade and Budapest have never been better, at least on the surface. Then again, we see a political partnership and cooperation between the dominant Serbian and the dominant Hungarian political party. If you ask Serbian citizens, you also hear that Viktor Orban is the most popular foreign figure among all leaders in the region. But then, despite all of that, we see and hear that the relation between the people actually are not improved, and that there is more segregation and less integration. How do we explain this paradox? Because I'm certain that there are many people who are not really understand how is it possible that despite all this in the surface, it still doesn't translate into some real improvements. What's your take on this?
Nationalism is quite powerful on both sides, and it's not the glue. It really divides the people. For example, when Miklos Horthy was rehabilitated in Hungarian parliament, nobody from ruling party Serbian from the ruling coalition or Serbian officials gave any kind of statement to oppose it. Everything was fine at the surface. So this, for example, didn't damage their political ties and good relations, but it traumatized the society and it provoked and disturbed the society deeply. So we have seen that politicians are ready, maybe for their political or other interest benefits, to overcome even the past, and not to deal the past in a proper way. But when it comes to the society level, we have seen that these kind of things disturb people quite abroad, and there is no very much needed social cohesion in society.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's now turn to a different topic altogether, which is the energy. I mean, you have put a lot of focus in your research about the issues of economic cooperation, especially in terms of energy. So how do you see relations between Serbia and Hungary in terms of energy? Is it a strategic partnership basically in that sense, or it is also, let's say, pragmatic, as we have heard about the foreign policy in general?
Thank you. Economic cooperation definitely is integral part of the relations between Serbia and Hungary, since they are neighboring countries, and the level of trade and investments is high. But the energy security, the energy sector is perhaps the new way of cooperation between the two countries, and that is mostly because of the new circumstances, the war in Ukraine. So just a brief background, both Serbia and Hungary are to a greater or lesser extent dependent on Russian oil and gas. And since the beginning of the war in Ukraine and the EU sanctions introduced to import, purchase and transfer of Russian oil, the relations have changed. So To answer, actually, I will answer your question. We believe that the energy cooperation in the energy sector is actually not so pragmatic, but mostly it is driven by economic interests that are short-term interests, and also the political goals and further deepening of the relations between the two regimes. And I will explain this on the example of oil supply. since the EU introduced sanctions on import of Russian oil, Serbia, which imports oil from Croatia through the JANAF pipeline, it means that Serbia doesn't have Russian oil anymore. However, Hungary still has it. Hungary imports oil through Druzhba pipeline, and Hungary was exempted from these sanctions because of its special landlocked position. So this is when Vučić and Orban agreed to build a new pipeline which would connect Serbia to the Druzhba pipeline. And here we can see why this kind of cooperation is there are economic interests behind it. For example, why does Serbia want to import Russian oil? Because they buy it at the dumping prices, and then they can export the oil derivatives at higher prices. So that is this short-term economic interest. But the question is whether there is actual rationale behind this announced project. The question is because the Druzhba pipeline itself is not such a reliable source anymore. It goes through Ukraine, and now with the war in Ukraine, the pipeline was attacked several times, and the whole network that is necessary for operability of the pipeline was attacked. So that is the first reason. But the second reason as well is the fact that Hungary is at the moment exempted from the sanctions doesn't mean that it will last longer. And by the time the pipeline is constructed, it could happen that because of the pressure from Brussels, Hungary would have to introduce the sanctions as well. And then we would have the pipeline, but no Russian oil. So that is also why this project is not very well thought. And why do we believe that there are political goals behind it? Because this is at core of both Serbian and Hungarian regime, trying to balance between the two sides and trying to play on both sides. So Hungary is trying to use its EU membership and Serbia its EU accession process on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are trying to maintain close relations with Russia and to import cheap Russian oil despite the war in Ukraine. And also that can be seen on the example of another energy project that was announced, and it is the construction of the new nuclear power plant Paks 2 in Hungary. The construction should be it still hasn't started, even though the process started in 2014, and the Russian company Rosatom should be the one that does the construction. And Vučić announced that that Serbia is interested in buying 5 to 10% of stakes in the Paks 2. Also, why is that? Is there any economic sense behind this? I will not go into too many details. There are pros and cons of this, but the fact is that Serbia would have to pay a high price for getting part of the ownership in the Paks 2, and that is the price that is higher than the electricity that Serbia would get from Paks 2, but that could also be done by the usual import-export business. So
sanctions there against Russia and the possibility of that also being
exactly, and there are also EU sanctions on Russian companies, which is also the reason why probably Serbia is involved in this project, because by introducing Serbian companies and involving them in this project, Serbia can cooperate with EU companies, while Russian companies cannot because of the sanctions. And in that way, Serbia is put in this unpleasant position of being some kind of a smuggler, and that can also...
Some would say pleasant.
Yes.
That's debatable.
Yeah, that would definitely worsen Serbia's image in the EU. So that is also one of the political interests behind all of this.
Thank you. Mr. Nemeth, what is your take on energy? How does it look like from the Hungarian perspective? We have heard President Vučić announce last year, after the oil stopped going, the Russian oil stopped going to JANAF from Croatia, that there'll be this extension of the pipeline. But according to what you know about this, is it something that is happening, or this is just not something that makes economic sense? And what other aspects of this energy cooperation that you should maybe single out that we missed?
Well, so far nothing has happened with regards to your first question. But what is very interesting is that the energy cooperation between Hungary and Serbia hasn't started last year. It dates back at least to 2009. At that year, there were several so-called gas rifts between Russia and Ukraine, which has resulted in Russia cutting off the major pipeline that goes through Ukraine and then reaches Hungary, and that somehow resulted in a very cold winter, not just in Hungary, but also in Serbia and also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this, let's say, realization that the Hungarian energy mix, or at least the pipelines through which Hungary receives fossil fuels, should be diversified, started around 2010. And this is why Hungary was one of the firm supporters of this so-called Turkish stream, or some call it Balkan stream. I'm going to refer to it as a Balkan stream, which basically also transmits Russian fossil fuels, but not through Ukraine, but through under the Black Sea, through Bulgaria, Serbia, and then this is the way it reaches Hungary. And as of today, that is the only pipeline ever since the war in Ukraine through which Hungary receives gas and oil from Russia or from any other sources possible. Obviously, we have already mentioned this, given Hungary's geographical position, it will take some time as well as financial means to diversify the pipeline system, the energy mix as such. It has already started in recent years. One example would be Hungary's involvement in the LNG terminal in Croatia. But also how I see it is that with the war in Ukraine, Serbia has become not just an important but a vital partner in Hungary's energy security, the number one partner in Hungary's energy security, because Serbia is basically guarantees as of today that Hungary receives fossil fuels to its territory. Obviously, it comes from Russia, but still, as of today, we don't really have another option than that. Another important aspect that I wanted to mention is that I really think that in terms of energy cooperation and energy security, Hungary perceives Serbia as some kind of role model. Because I can see some patterns in how Hungary follows the same interactions that Serbia is having with international companies or countries that are rich in fossil fuels, for example, with Azerbaijan. It is not only Serbia, but Hungary and many other countries from Central and Southeast Europe that are now eyeing at the opportunity of having gas and oil exported from Azerbaijan. And I think Serbia in this sense served as some kind of role model to Hungary. That first Serbia started the discussions, and then Hungary saw this opportunity and realized that it would also be good to diversify its energy mix. So in this sense, I think this cooperation is mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial in this sense that they can, in a way, the two governments can not only threaten ties and help each other out, but also to share good practices with each other. The case in point here is their cooperation or future cooperation with Azerbaijan.
So in this sense, you would not say that this cooperation is mainly political, but is actually driven by very real economic interests?
Exactly. And the economic interest is that
geographical,
caused by
geography.
Interest is basically of geographic interest for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's now turn back to the question of the national minorities. There is something I wanted to ask you before. We have seen in other countries where Hungarian minorities live around the region, so in Slovakia and Romania, etc. We have heard lots of controversies about, in terms of the very negative reactions to what Orban was doing in Hungary in terms of commemoration of the Trianon Treaty and some things like that. in Serbia, this has been completely absent. We have not heard this being a problem in Serbia. From the Hungarian perspective, do you see any difference between all these governments, how they're perceived in Hungary? Like, is there some kind of a notion that Serbia is a friendly country where Hungarians have their rights protected because of these relations, where it is different in other cases? Like, is this thing even important on the Hungarian domestic political scene?
Well, it's a very interesting issue. Of course it is. As I said, it's an identity issue, and it will probably remain like this. So it can be heated at any time. It can be dropped. So you can play with this nationalism like this. We know it in every country in our region. So it's always a politically motivated issue. It never comes really from the people. You know, it's always organized. You know it better than us. But what is interesting is that, first of all, it related to this issue, what I said already, that Orban's politics is oftentimes very partisan. So it's in the name of the Hungarian state. He actually does partisan politics. So it's very obvious with Serbia. It's in, let's say, Slovakia, it's very much up to who is on power and who is in friendly relationship, which party is in friendly relationship with others. Relations are significantly different when it's a friendly government like Robert Fico's government, who is not even called itself nationalist, but still kind of person who they get along very well, or the current coalition government in Slovakia, So it's partly about this. Therefore, Slovaks are usually more worried about Hungarian dominance. They are really there is part of their DNA somewhat. Romania, it's pretty well managed, I would say, by every Hungarian government. It's very important. It's a big neighbor, and most Hungarians live in Romania, and they are a little bit like actually the Serbian governments, that they let the Hungarian Orban government do whatever they want, which mainly it's a huge influence through financing. Big businesses, creating a local clientele, but also pulling in a lot of funds. So this is a kind of win-win for at least a bunch of interest groups. So this is the thing. But of course, the minority issue is also a brain drain towards Hungary. So to speak about another aspect. So obviously, every country in Europe, there is a skilled labor shortage, including Hungary. So we are not pulling people from the West, but we are pulling them from the number one pool of resource of people is the Hungarians abroad. As you said, that with the double citizenship, it become easy for specifically non-EU countries like Serbia and Ukraine. It's also controversial because, of course, the Hungarians in the neighboring countries are typically supported by Fidesz government to participate in government. So it means that both in Romania and sometimes in Slovakia, in Serbia, when Hungarian minority ethnic parties are in the government, that's also an influence in relationship building. Through companies, this is also possible. So empowering Hungarian business people in the region with funding and with investment from Hungary, typically from companies which are state-owned or state-backed. So very much the companies which invest in this region are state-backed companies. And this is significantly different from the fact that, let's say, German companies invest in telecom or wherever, or energy business, because if it's all state-owned, it never comes freely. It's a political relationship. It's similar to how the Chinese invest. So it's significantly different than, and I think it's also something worth to watch, which kind of companies invest in the region and how independent they are. For example, like 4iG, which is a big telecom company, which was a no company 5 years ago. It's not a regional, huge telecom company which buys Vodafone in Hungary. So it's not their own money. You know, this company, it's all hugely indebted. So now they are present in the region. Is it a risk? Is it not a risk? So there are many layers of this, you know, of this relationship, and I think that is really worth to watch all of them.
And we know from election results that ethnic Hungarians in other countries usually vote for Fidesz in the elections. And my question is, when they migrate to Hungary, as they often do, are they still Fidesz voters? Is this also something which is a factor in terms of, let's say, something that Fidesz can benefit from?
Well, I think they are not the same people. You know, the people who come to Hungary, they are the younger families with kids. The voters are typically the older who sit at home and who need the Hungarian Alliance here to go there and help them to fill in the ballot paper and then take it to the, you know, the post office. So that's not the same people. It's a different public, and I think both are taken care.
Thank you. Let's open the floor now for the questions. If there are any, I ask you to raise your hands, and then we will get the microphone to you. Of course. I can't prevent you, so feel free.
So just to break the ice, two questions for Ferenc and Zsuzsa. And both are kind of similar, because both are on Orban before, when he was in the opposition, maybe Orban in the future, when he will be in the opposition, maybe, and now. And so, Ferenc, you used an anecdote. I will use one of my own. In 2005, I was at the AFET committee meeting in the European Parliament that was transmitted live on one of Hungarian TVs. It was a never-seen moment. I never saw an AFET meeting transmitted live. In a member state TV, maybe it happened, but and it was all about the then, well, not then, in 2003 and 4, there was a question of ethnic tensions in Vojvodina, you know, whether they existed or not. But at that time, Orban's Fidesz MEPs in the European Parliament were exactly instrumentalizing this issue in the wake of the 2006 parliamentary elections in Hungary. So, what happens with this historical reconciliation if Fidesz goes into the opposition? That's the question to you. And the question for Zsuzsa is, well, I will quote from your excellent book that recently got out, Tainted Democracy, about the Orban regime in Hungary, and we used the quote in our report. Well, back in the 1990, when you were in Fidesz with Orban, your, you know, foreign policy strategy was all about Europe, 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 Europe. In 2007, and you quote this from Orban, when he was a vocal critic of Gyurcsány and his government, Orban said famously, and maybe I will not get it completely right, but this is the gist of it: oil may come from the east, but freedom always comes from the west. That was an Orban quote. And now, in the context of the war in Ukraine, we talked to local think tanks in Budapest that were advocating for a Western turn of the Orban government. For example, even talked about the Paks 2 nuclear power station, so about how it would probably be more pragmatic in the wake of the sanctions and everything to build this extension with the French or with the South Koreans, for example. So why, and this is a question to you, why is Orban sticking to Russia so much? In Serbia, there is an internal political dimension to that. But what is it in Hungary? And maybe, you know, Ferenc, if you want to answer to that question as well, please do.
in the meantime, you can think about some more. Please.
Okay, then if you don't mind, Zsuzsa, I will
Go
start
ahead.
with the phase of reconciliation, the political reconciliation. Well, it will be very difficult, in my opinion, and the most difficult aspect will be for the opposition to build the trust of the Hungarian minority, not just in Vojvodina, but in other countries that borders Hungary, because of the dual citizenship. The possibility to have Hungarian citizenship because, and we mentioned it rightfully, it is not only about the economic gains that the ethnic Hungarians living abroad or living on the other side of the border gain, but it's a huge symbolism. It symbolizes that for them it's a symbol for that they are in fact Hungarians and they want to be Hungarians. And they remember that it was the Fidesz government who made it possible for them to acquire dual citizenship. And this memory, I would say, or this gratitude will be very hard to top, or will be very hard to forget. And there will be a lot of criticism brought up from the times when the current opposition was in power and how they neglected or challenged this strong support that was given by the Fidesz government to the minority. What will not change, in my opinion, is the strong EU support of the political parties in Hungary towards the Western Balkan states. So I don't expect any, let's say, major changes in terms of the support and in terms of the level of support and assistance from Hungary to the Western Balkans and to Serbia in particular. But the biggest question is whether Hungary could still be, in the eyes of the leaderships of the Western Balkan states, Serbia in particular, be as credible as Orban is. Because this is one aspect that we haven't really mentioned, is that no matter the criticism coming from the EU side or coming from Western European states that Orban is not a good role model for the Western Balkan states, the majority of the political elites in the Balkans perceive him as an ally and as a credible partner within the EU. Which also gives Budapest a lot of leverage. And so with regards to, let's say, the future of reconciliation, I would mainly be worried about this credibility issue that might be on the horizon should the government composition be changed in Hungary.
Thank you, Ms. Eleni.
Okay, so that is really a very important issue and a very hot topic. And I think we at home are still trying to figure out exactly what is happening related to the war in Ukraine, because as far as I know, when the war broke out, there was consideration in the Prime Minister's office what kind of opinion to represent. And how to ally with the European mainstream. And then, as we know, it didn't happen. And Orban's party, which was just before election, just like in Serbia, figured out a new narrative, which is a kind of peace narrative, which is very tricky, because obviously everyone wants peace, so it's really easy to sell politically. It's everyone, elites and people, all people want peace. But we all know that this is peace would happen if the aggressor would withdraw without a minute, right? But this is not what Orban represents openly, but basically pushing some kind of burden on the Ukrainian side, or especially on the West, to question whether support of the West is meaningful. There are plenty of of quotes from Orban where he actually regards Ukraine as a failed state, and doesn't seem and propagate that the West actually should stop providing arms. I'm pretty sure you are aware of this narrative. So, and this is very, very well working in political campaigns. However, it doesn't anything closer to the end of the war. So why is it? Because the question is why is he doing and why he choose this way? I think there are various reasons. The one thing is that the Orban's foreign policy and the kind of aggression or bully or strong profile of it, or maverick, if I want to use a kind of nicer word, is because he has such a stable power in Hungary. So he really can count on then he will stay on power for a while. Hungarian foreign policy is done in the Prime Minister's office. He doesn't really have to discuss this with other coalition partners. You know how it looks like because you also live with the country with a strong one-party, mainly one-party government. So that is a very solid basis for foreign policy. The second thing is that Hungary is deeply isolated in the European Union. We didn't speak about that yet, but it's important to put it on a table that the country looks after kind of 10 years of relative tolerance from European partners. It's not the case any longer. Hungary is not a trusted EU member partner almost for no one. There's a radicalization of the Hungarian government behavior within the EU. There are more force, more vetoing. Whether it's more important issues that Hungary is vetoing, let's say 3 or 5 years ago, which were mainly kind of declaration. Now they're hardcore issues the Hungarian government needs to veto in order to represent its interest. This is obvious that further isolation is the kind of strategy what many of the larger EU member countries figured out, and it's widely supported. And this is also a very important environment in terms of how Orban is behaving in the Western Balkans. Obviously, there are all kind of very rational considerations on energy security and many other things as we've discussed earlier, but that is also an element of this. Plus, so Orban doesn't really, when he chose not to go with the EU, it was because his position to make any influence on EU politics is only possible if he says no in certain times. So this kind of disruptive strategy is the only thing within the EU which he has in his hand. It's really dangerous, I believe. It's really very bad for Hungary, because now Hungary is pulling itself out from a trusted circle of European countries. So we pay very high price for it. But I think he's doing this because he cannot really do much if he wants to remain a kind of strong man, which he regards himself. Consolidation is really not in the profile of such a leader. We cannot expect that Hungary would consolidate within the EU. And the war situation demonstrates the clearest. There is also EU energy dependency, bad energy dependency, so there is also a need. There are internal political reasons, as you write also in your report, that since 2014, one of the key policy which brings Fidesz on power again and again is keeping the energy prices low, household energy prices, which are basically based on cheap Russian energy sources, which is not questioned. Hungary is not very easy to create new relationships. It's a landlocked country. It does through the Turk Stream, but it's also, as you said, an LNG in buying, but it's much, much more. I mean, for example, Croatians want to sell energy to Hungary like seven higher prices than I think to other EU partners. So because now they have the leverage, so we are not so easygoing in many things. Plus, we are not the only one. So when Orban is picking out a kind of pro-Russia narratives and, let's say, speaks against further sanctions, he is also serving other EU member countries. He is serving Germany, he is serving the Czech Republic and Slovakia, all those countries who are maybe not at that deep level, but still dependent on Russian energy. So he's also playing with, speaking for the others, because that is a possibility for deal making. So he is a dealer in everything. Nothing is cheap, nothing is free, everything has a price. And this is how this logic is looking. So it's a complex issue, but altogether it's really very, very harmful for us.
Can I ask you a very brief question? And I would like to have a very brief answer. All taken into account, having in mind Hungary's status within the European Union, is having Orban as an ally for enlargement a good or a bad thing?
Well, that's your biggest concern, that there are positive things and there are also risks. I mean, EU Commissioner is Oliver Várhelyi, who is Hungarian. So obviously there is another leverage from Hungarian state through Várhelyi on the region. But he is very isolated within the EU because he is not trusted, because he is using this position oftentimes for informal relationships. So that is definitely, I think, one of the main questions of this report and your follow-up and policy making. How far the region's countries should rely on Orban's Hungary's government? How far is it good? How to diversify relationship? Because it's a risky enterprise.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? I don't see any hands. Perhaps there aren't any. If there are, you can just please, wave towards me, and I'll just direct the microphone towards you. In the meantime, Mayo, I would like to ask you kind of a reverse question. Having in mind all which we have said here, is the influence of Hungary in the region overall positive or negative? Now, of course, it's very hard to say in this binary terms, but when you always take into account, what's your rating of it?
Yeah, it's definitely bigger than it was. That's the first thing. In certain area, it's both. I cannot say whether what is then bigger. Is it the negative influence the bigger than the positive? Because Hungary became quite important in many aspects. For example, in financial market, the companies has a big share, for example, in Serbia, but also like Zsuzsanna mentioned, it comes with a price and strings attached. Nothing is free. So we have seen many downsides. Like we have seen that investments in media across the region also had negative effects. Either they are like, for example, money for to support right-wing groups and right-wing narratives that can harm society, or what Zsuzsanna mentioned when it comes to the EU level and EU integration. Hungary invested a lot, even resources. They have dedicated EU experts to support countries in the Western Balkans to accelerate its process. But it's very questionable what kind of the regime and the system that Hungary currently promotes, and whether it will truly support countries to get closer to the EU. And somehow my point is, the closer the Hungary and, for example, Serbia and other countries get, they are further away from the EU. And certain things in energy market, it's beneficial at the moment, but in the long run, it can also be not very good from economic perspective. Some deals can cost us very much because everything has a price. If Serbia, for example, has gas storage in Hungary, but it's paying a lot to actually have that kind of storage. So nothing is without any kind of price. So it could be positive, but it could be also negative.
Thank you. There's one topic which we haven't mentioned a lot today, and we don't really have time to go into details, but it's still worth mentioning, and this is the Hungarian media influence in Serbia. So, Ivana, what's your take on this? Is this media influence strong? Is it something that should be mentioned? Is it something does it deserve to be mentioned along all of these other influences of Hungary in the region?
Yes, it definitely deserves to be mentioned as well. And just like Maya mentioned, the main aspect of media presence in the Western Balkans is exactly this supporting of right-wing leaders and, friendly regimes of Orban regime. The most prominent example is in Slovenia, although it is not the Western Balkans, but that is one of the examples how through media investments, Orban supported the former Prime Minister Janša. And also what is really interesting is how through these media, for example, also Hungarian language media in Vojvodina, how this propaganda and how the liberal beliefs of the Orban regime are spread. For example, the anti-migration narratives, anti-LGBT, also against climate change and stuff like that. So that is what is definitely being spread through these through media that Hungarian companies are acquiring. And so that is two parts. So the narratives and the support to right-wing parties. In North Macedonia, there are also many media investments, and mostly there are some corrupt affairs and through advertising. So that is some of the main media investments in the Western Balkans.
Thank you. This certainly deserves a panel of its own, I would say, but let's leave that for another occasion. Ferenc, for the end, very negative topic, but still also deserves to be mentioned. The war in Ukraine. Would you say that the war has brought challenges to Serbo-Hungarian relations, or it has actually strengthened the partnership between Serbia and Hungary, having in mind all these energy interests? And also, what's your expectation about what can happen if the war doesn't end, if the sanctions against Russia are strengthened in the future and not lifted? Do you see that this partnership will be further challenged or further strengthened?
Well, I think strangely, the war in Ukraine brought even closer cooperation between Serbia and Hungary. We discussed energy cooperation in great details. I think that can serve as a prime example to answer your question. What was very interesting to me is how Hungary has been approaching the enlargement of the European Union ever since the war broke out. Because for years, Hungary advocated a faster, speedier integration of the Western Balkans, but in particular Serbia, based on the notion that it is the EU membership that could secure peace and stability of the region as well as for Hungary. And with the war in Ukraine, this narrative was very much justified in Budapest, that there is an additional need for a stronger, more geopolitically focused enlargement, because it is the way to avoid an armed conflict such as what is going on with Ukraine. So it is only through EU membership and the stability of the Western Balkans in the Hungarian narrative that can provide a peaceful environment for Hungary as well. And that was the same narrative that they used in terms of EU enlargement for Ukraine. Hungary also supported granting a candidate status for Ukraine early last year. And this security perspective was very much in front in those arguments, saying that it is the EU membership that can bring peace and stability, as well as the security of the Hungarian kin minority. So I would say that the war in Ukraine did in fact got Serbia and Hungary even more closer, but on the other hand, it also gave like this huge leverage over the narrative coming from Budapest with regards to the necessity to enlarge the EU with the Western Balkan states.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our panel. I would like to thank, first of all, our panelists today, and of course, all of you who have watched us here, either in person or online. And once again, I invite you to read this very good publication by the Belgrade Centre for Security Policy, and I hope to see you again on some other occasion. Bye.